Bye.
Oh,
Okay, you are live.
okay. Good morning, everybody. It's now 8 o'clock, and I'll call the May 13th, 2021 regular meeting of the Financial Advisory Commission to order. I see that all commission members are present except for Frank Brown. I haven't heard from Frank, so I don't know whether he will be joining us or not. But welcome, everybody, and welcome, staff. I sent out an agenda the other day, and I'd like to propose an amendment to the agenda requested by the city manager, and that is that we bring up the new business item and the primary item of discussion today about the Resiliency Authority up to right after approval of the minutes. Is there any objection to doing that? Hearing none, the agenda will stand corrected so that new business Resilience Authority Ordinance 0-14-21 will be taken up after approval of the minutes. So with that change, are there any other revisions or corrections to the agenda? Hearing none, entertain a motion to approve the agenda as corrected or revised. I'm sorry, as revised.
So moved.
Okay, moved by, who was that, Bob Burden? Second by Jim Cardillo. And any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the agenda as revised, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Agenda is approved as revised. You have two sets of minutes, April 8th, 2021 regular meeting and April 22nd, 2021 special meeting. They were sent out along with the agenda several days ago. Have you had an opportunity to review the minutes? Yes. Any revisions or corrections to either set of minutes? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the April 8th regular meeting and April 22nd special meeting. Motion made by Mr. Meehan, Ed Meehan, seconded by Jim Cardillo. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. The minutes of April 8th and April 22nd are approved. Now we'll move to the relocated item on the agenda about the Resiliency Authority Ordinance 0-14-21. Jackie Giles, welcome. I don't think we've had you at one of our meetings. Nice to have you with us. Okay. David, I sent out to the commission all the materials relating to the Resiliency Authority and to that ordinance, being the ordinance, the fiscal note, and the staff report. I also sent out a link to the Enabling Authority and state law. So hopefully everybody's had an opportunity to review them. I know that I have a significant number of comments and questions, but I'll hold off on that until after we have a staff presentation and begin discussion. So David, let me turn it over to you and see how you'd like to proceed with this today.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. I appreciate that. So I'll give a little bit of background and then ask Jackie to kind of give an overview of the legislation. She prepared the staff report, so she's very familiar with it. And I'm hopeful that City Attorney Mike Lyles will join us as well, because he's also very familiar with the legislation. So during the state legislative session a year ago, they passed the enabling legislation for Resilience Financing Authority statewide. When they originally proposed it was just going to be for cities over 50,000 people and for all the counties that would be able to establish it. As the legislation worked its way through the process, they did away with those limits, so it's basically available to any city or county. It was actually proposed by Annapolis and by Anne Arundel County to address some of the upcoming sea level rise issues that we're going to be facing over the next 50 years or so. So as a result of that legislation passing, we formed a joint work group with the county to work through the legislation to get the basic details and structure worked out. That happened last summer and into the fall. We had a steering committee, but then we also had 3 work groups, one that looked at the structure, one that looked at the financing mechanisms, and one looked at the type of projects that were going to be done by the authority. So based on those work groups and the outcomes that and the recommendations that they came up with, the county attorney's office drafted legislation. It took a while. We thought it was going to go a little bit faster, but it took a while. They completed that about a month ago. We've had several joint meetings to discuss the legislation and work through those details. It got to the final form for the county, and then they handed that off to us so that we could put it into this format for city legislation. The county introduced it on April 19th to the county council, so they're going through the process as well. And we introduced it, I think, on the 26th of April. So it's been through, went through first reader. It went through public hearing on Monday. Didn't get any comments at all on the legislation. So now it will go on to the committees to have in-depth discussions. So you notice from the 3 things that we looked at, the 3 separate sort of groupings that we had work groups on, the structure is sort of described here, but it's going to be similar to some of the other sort of independent groups that the county has, like the economic development group that they have. It's going to be structured similar to that. So that was addressed. The types of projects is generally addressed as being related to infrastructure. It's narrowed down to projects that will or infrastructure that is going to be affected by climate change. So resilience is a very, very broad area, and they've narrowed it down to those things that are affected by climate change. So that's sort of addressed. What's not addressed in here, and I'm sure you all noticed that, and it's pretty obvious, is where the funding is going to come from. So the decision was made to allow the Resilience Authority themselves to make those recommendations to the city and county of what they think the best sources of funding will be for these projects. They're going to have a ongoing funding source because they're going to issue bonds and they're going to have to make debt service payments. So it's not going to be able to be one-time funding opportunities. They're going to have to establish an ongoing stream of funding for these projects. When this was first being considered, there was some discussion of potentially using the hotel tax as a funding source for these. That may still be an option. There's been some taps on that funding source over the last year for art and public places and for affordable housing. So that's not quite the easy answer that it was back a couple of years ago when this was first being considered. But that may still be a viable funding source. What we don't want is for grants to be the only funding source, because that is so iffy that you can't really rely on it certainly to issue bonds, maybe for one-time type of issues, but as an ongoing funding source, that's not really viable. So that would be at the bottom of the list, and there needs to be other more reliable and ongoing revenue sources. So I guess with that, I will turn it over to Jackie to sort of go through the legislation, maybe just go through her staff report of the highlights, and then we can have a chance to hear concerns and answer questions.
Can you hear me? Nope. Can't hear me? Wait a second.
Jackie, if you want, you can come and use she's right next door to me, so we'll just change chairs.
This happened to me the other day in Zoom. There's something with my microphones. MIT, I asked them to try to help me out with it, and they couldn't figure it out. Good morning.
Morning.
Having a Zoom issue with my microphone. Okay, so the way that we're looking at setting this resilience authority up, for the first step would be to establish the resilience authority, which this legislation does. Then the second step would be to the funding for the resilience authority, what portions coming from the county and what's from the city. And then the third step would be after the resilience authority is set up and we hire the director and chief financial officer, is the report that they issue after the first year identifying the infrastructure projects and requesting any additional funding if necessary at that point. So we're at step one, establishing the resilience authority. As I just mentioned, there would be a director, and that person would be hired first, then a chief financial officer, and they would establish the office. The board members, there would be 12 board members, 9 of which would be residents of the county, and 3 which would be residents from the city. And none of them can be a city staff member or an elected official. There would be advisors to the board, which would come from city and county staff. And they would be the directors of public works, planning and zoning, and emergency management. They're called something different, a little bit different in the county than the city in some cases. Each member would have a 4-year term, that is for, and they would be staggered terms. The types of projects that would be identified, as David mentioned, were infrastructure related to climate change impacts to mitigate and avoid those types of impact and build resiliency within both the county and the city. Some of those projects may overlap because climate change impacts don't always recognize our jurisdictional boundaries. For example, where right now the city has a grant from the Department of Defense to look at resiliency type projects for climate change impacts that between the city, the county, and the Naval Academy. So that's an example, but we have a grant for that project right now, but that's a kind of example of kind of transboundary issues. During the first year, what we envision is that probably city and county staff will be the main entities that are proposing projects. We have a number of, both the city and the county have a number of projects in the pipeline, or those that we would like to address, but lack funding to do that. So they would be the ones mostly proposing the projects, and probably continuing, they would be the ones that are coming up and identifying projects. And they may be more involved with the management of those projects, at least to some extent, the first year, as we kind of shake things out and see how the Resilience Authority is going to work. In the future, it may be more contractors and others, but the beginning, we think it's probably city and county staff. Of course, the first priority for the city will be the Hillman Garage City Dock, reimagining and redesign. Of course, we're already engaged in that with a contractor, but there's some other work to be done there. There's the pump stations and their barrier walls and other things that will maybe needing help from the Resilience Authority, so that's our first priority in the city. And that would be the first project coming out of the box for the Resilience Authority to fund. For the county, I've spoken with their environmental director, and they've identified about $20 million worth of road and bridge improvements, replacements, and repairs. These are roads and bridges that are impacted regularly by flooding, storm surges, and severe storm events. So that would be their first priority. We also discussed doing a study for coming up with different ideas to address the impacts of climate change to Eastport, which is very low lying. It's mostly private property. The vast majority is private property on the shoreline. So there's, how do you address that, and how does the city work with private property owners on that? And then on the county side, their most low-lying area is the Shady Side Peninsula, which is already flooding. They have their water table is already percolating up, so they have a lot of wet ground. The Mayo Peninsula is also a problem, and other little small peninsulas in South County, but it's particularly Shady Side. So we talked about perhaps there would be a way to do some urban suburban feasibility study and come up with projects to address those two very low-lying areas. There are also other areas within the city and the county that do not have any stormwater management whatsoever because they predate stormwater management requirements. And some of those areas are communities that fall within that category are flooding regularly and are impacted by severe storm events. So those are kind of three areas we will be looking at right away. So the authority has, what you can see in the legislation, the types of activities that they can undertake are fairly broad. They can, it's improvements, it's replacement, it's new projects, and it's kind of all the infrastructure related to climate change impacts. Anything else, David, we should touch on? That's a broad overview. You have the legislation. I'm sure you've reviewed it. So do you have any questions for either one of us? James.
Good morning. Thank you very much. A question as to the prioritization of projects, given that this is a shared county city, how is the prioritization determined? Is there a board that votes on it, and is there representation from each? I'm asking.
What's it?
The board is.
Yes, yeah. The board that I mentioned, the 9 are from the county and 3 are from the city. They review the projects that come in and prioritize them, and they make their recommendations, and then they find funding for them.
Okay. And if the project is somehow shared between city and county, that's just part of their prioritization and
Right.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Fred, you're muted. Fred, you're muted.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Okay, let me take a few minutes. I have a number of comments and questions. Some of them are very technical, relating to specific provisions of the ordinance that I'd at least like to get on the table. And then I'd like to hear from other members of the commission. So David, are you there?
Yep.
Okay. And some role of them may form basis for reports from the commission. They may not, but at least want to get them on the table. I think you touched on a very important issue, and that is funding and financing, because we know from the state law and from the ordinance that the authority cannot impose taxes, but they do have the right to receive money from the state, the county, and the city government, and from other sources to support bond issuances. So even, I hope nobody is suggesting or saying that this won't have any, impact on city taxpayers, because it very well may down the road if the city is called upon to provide funding and financing to the authority for support of various bond issued projects or projects that are not bond issued. So I think that is critical to understand. And when we look at the state law, which is layered either underneath or on top of the local ordinance, 22-110 of the local government article says that the local governing body may dedicate any revenues of the local government to repayment of bonds or to support the operation of infrastructure projects of an authority. So again, another indication that this is not an authority created totally independent of the county and the city, and totally independent of city and county financing, but very well could be looking to both the city and the county, or either one, for financial support which indirectly or directly may tie back down to city or county taxpayers. So that's number one. Number two, section 2.58070 talks about net earnings net earnings of the authority may benefit only the county or the city and may not benefit any person. Now, I'm not quite sure what net earnings the authority may have, and I'm not sure what's intended by that particular provision, and what types of benefits might be achieved or realized from net earnings by the county or the city, and then more importantly, how those are going to be apportioned between the county and the city. I think that's a detail in several respects that is not addressed in this very broad legislation. And because there is probably likely, I would suspect, going to be county and city financial support to projects, not directly, but perhaps indirectly, that each bond, to me, it seems like each bond issuance should be approved by the county council or the city council and the city council, because they may be called upon later on to help fund and support them. I note that in 2.58.100, that talks about the contents of each bond issuance authorization resolution. What that essentially is, before the authority can issue bonds, they have to adopt a resolution specifying a number of different things about the project and the bond issuance. One thing that to me is conspicuously absent from the list of things that have to be included in a bond authorization resolution is the source of funds for repayment. That, to me, that should be clear at the very outset, so that the governing bodies of the two jurisdictions know where the authority is proposing to get its revenue to fund the repayment of the debt, and also so the taxpayers know. So to me, that should be included in the in any bond issuance authorizing resolution. Next, section 2.58.030 says that upon dissolution of the authority, title to property owned by the authority vest in the city and the county, and all obligations of the authority shall be transferred to and assumed by the city and the county. That's a pretty important, very, very broad statement. At least in my mind, that should provide that in the situation of a dissolution, the city and the county would determine jointly further disposition of the property. So if the authority owns a piece of real property and upon dissolution is transferred to Anne Arundel County and City of Annapolis, how does it get from Anne Arundel County and City of Annapolis to either jurisdiction? How is it divvied up? So I think it's probably not likely or possible to define that today, but I think the ordinance should at least say upon the situation of property vesting in the city and the county, then at that point, the city and county should determine jointly how it will be further disposed as between the two jurisdictions. And likewise, because upon dissolution, all obligations of the authority will be transferred to and assumed by the city and county. I think the ordinance should provide that the city and county shall determine jointly how the obligations are assumed. And the city perhaps should be responsible only for obligations relating to city resiliency project and should not be responsible for obligations relating to county projects. If there are projects that are joint city-county projects, then perhaps there should be something worked out as to the apportionment the responsibility for the obligation, and the city shouldn't potentially be stuck with the whole thing. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen. 40 years from now when the authority is dissolved, but let's plan for it now. How that's going to be addressed. I note in 2.58.050F that the chair of the authority is appointed annually by the county executive. I thought that this was supposed to be essentially a joint authority, and it would seem perhaps a more appropriate way to deal with this is to have the chair appointed either by the county executive and mayor jointly, or county executive with concurrence of the mayor, or alternate the appointing responsibility year to year. 1 year is the city, 1 year is the county, rather than leaving it every year that the county executive has the right and the authority and the power to appoint the chair of the authority. 2.58.040 deals with membership composition on the authority. I think is a very important provision, but the articles of incorporation really say nothing about, at least nothing in detail about the composition of the membership of the corporation, other than it shall have 12 directors and identifies the names of the individual. There's nothing in the articles of incorporation that identify or dictate the composition, how many are from the city, how many are from the county, and the other things provided for in in the ordinance. I personally, I think it's pretty important that be addressed in the articles of incorporation, and it would not be atypical, to have something like that addressed in the articles of incorporation, where there are specific requirements or provisions, for or regulating the appointment of directors of corporations such as this, and particularly when governments are involved in creating a quasi-governmental corporation. The articles of incorporation, I think, should also provide that they cannot be amended without the approval of the county council and city council. That I'm not suggesting it would happen, but in the absence of that, regardless of what's in the ordinance, the governing key governing document of the authority could be amended by provisions in general corporate law, without the approval of the county or the city. So I think that that limitation should be built into the articles of incorporation. A question: will the Resilience Authority be a 501c3? David, Jackie?
That's what the anticipation was, Fred. That's what the group recommended that looked at the organizational structure of the authority.
Okay, then I think if that's going to be the case, I think there are provisions that need to address the nonprofit status that need to be in the articles of incorporation that are not in there now. There's certainly boilerplate, but there are probably 2 or 3 typical provisions that you find in 501c3 articles. And I think that they are in the articles of Arundel Community Development Services and Economic Development Corporation and Workforce Development Corporation, which are privatized county spinoffs. So I strongly suggest that those should be in there. And then there are a couple of terms in the ordinance that I think should be defined. One is incorporating local government. It's somewhat ambiguous as to whether the incorporating local government is the county, is the city, or both. And the reason I say it is because that term is used, I believe, several places in the ordinance, and it's a little bit ambiguous who or what entity it's referring to. That and I see that open space is a permitted type of resilient project in state law and also in the ordinance. I have no idea, just from a neophyte of this stuff involving resilience, how open space plays into being a resilience project or a resilience issue. Can you enlighten me?
So open space can be a resilience issue because it can retain stormwater and treat it and also control it. So by letting it absorb and seep in, if you have an open space, especially a forested open space, any other kind of vegetation, it serves as a filtration, not only as filtration, but to absorb. So it can slow erosion, it can slow sea level rise, and it also provides air quality benefits, so carbon sequestration. So whereas open space is not an infrastructure project, it is it serves a purpose to create a more resilient area. It's like a buffer area in some cases to
All right, so
storm surge.
let me ask this. Was there any discussion, or do you envision that the authority might potentially acquire land as open space, for this purpose?
They can acquire land. It's part of what I believe that's in the definitions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't.
So
Yeah,
and I don't know. I mean, that's something we can explore further. I'm sure that's something that some of this has to be worked out, but
yeah.
that is one of their abilities to acquire property.
Okay. And any thought as to whether those types of open space projects might qualify under for project open space funding? Or we're getting into details that probably haven't been discussed yet.
They could, yeah, they absolutely could, Fred. I think so. So some areas, the strategy is going to be to retreat, right? That especially some places where you have residences in low-lying areas, the best strategy is just to retreat from those. So in that case, I could envision the authority buying those properties and holding those properties, and the people moving off and dealing with the flooding issues that way.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, David. I think that concludes my comments. I appreciate your indulgence in listening to me ramble on, but it was interesting looking at all this and just trying to come up with some cogent thoughts. So let me turn it over to any other commission members who have comments or questions. Bob?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I concur with all of the concerns that our chairman, Fred Sussman, expressed concerning this legislation. As most of you know, I'm somewhat of a skeptic on this resiliency authority. I was when we were discussing the state enabling legislation. It's not a question of whether the concept perhaps may have merit. It may very well have merit, but I've been very concerned about the process and how this process has moved along and developing the state enabling legislation. I do have concerns about it. And I also think that the current execution here, of this is problematic. There are some what I would consider to be very important issues that should be determined ahead of time and not wait for this authority to be established to decide what they are, i.e. funding sources, a very good example of this. Certainly the liability that the city and the county potentially face, with the commitments that this authority may make over the course of its lifespan. As Fred addressed, it needs to perhaps be further ironed out. If this legislation were to pass, this authority is going to immediately hit the ground with close to $250,000 of expenses right off the bat, which the city and the county are going to have to fund. And what are those expenses? Those expenses are codified in the legislation. You need to hire an executive director and you need to hire a CFO. If these two individuals are going to be responsible for overseeing, issuing, and managing tens of millions of dollars of bond issuances. These are six-figure income positions. If you're going to get the caliber and quality of the people that you want, to be able to manage this. And that's just beginning. And so the city and the county are going to have to fund that. And they may have to fund it for more than just a year. They may have to fund it for a handful of years until the authority, if in fact this authority is created, without any predetermined funding sources, has to figure out where their funding is going to come from. You could potentially be looking at an infrastructure, an authority infrastructure that's going to have around $250,000 or perhaps more in expenses annually, even before you look at how you're going to use additional funding sources to be able to support debt service for bonds and stuff like that. I mean, a lot of this needs to be ironed out, in my opinion, before we start moving forward on establishing this authority here. Sure, it may be easy to put it off on the authority and this new developed board of directors, which pretty much is limited in what they can do without getting, the approval of the county executive and or the mayor. So as a board of directors, they are operating under conditions that perhaps a normal board of directors may not have to deal with in terms of exercising their fiduciary authorities and so forth and responsibilities. But, nonetheless, my concerns, echo those of Fred, plus what I've also mentioned here. And I'm just not comfortable with this right now as it is currently, progressing here. I just think that there's going to be potential problems down the road that have not been ironed out. I am concerned, by the way, about the imbalance of the membership. I was anticipating that with a board of 12, you'd have 4 appointed by the county, 4 appointed by the city, and then the remaining 4 recommended by the appointees, to fill out the balance of the 12 with the approval of the county executive and mayor. And then that way you would have a representative body. By the way, you mentioned the Economic Development Corporation of Anne Arundel County. I was involved in the creation of that many years ago. And that's the way it was originally set up. There were a set of appointees by the county executive. Then those appointees went ahead and appointed or recommended and seated on the board with the approval of the county executive, the remaining board members to round it out to the number that they had. Now it has changed since then, granted, but I would be more comfortable with a balance of 4, 4, and then 4 with staggered terms. And then, of course, as Fred mentioned, at the end of the day, the liability issue for the city and the county is still there for everything that the authority does, which means that at the end of the day, the taxpayers of the city and of the county may end up having to receive some of that liability and be able to fulfill the responsibilities that come from that. So that's my 2 cents worth. And that's kind of where I sit. And I'm not sure that I've heard anything yet to alleviate, some of these concerns that I have about the process. Again, and I want to make it very clear, the concept itself of a resiliency authority perhaps may have merit. I mean, this is not something that's been around a long time. It's, relatively recently new per se. But I am concerned about the execution in this case as it pertains to the city and even, the county. I would have liked to have seen more due diligence done on this. And I would have liked to see some of the issues that are being put off till later addressed now as we're putting this thing together. So those are my thoughts. Thank you for your indulgence and for hearing me out. I appreciate it.
Other commission members? Okay, Ed?
Fred?
Yes.
Yep, and let me apologize at the outset. I'm not sure if my internet connection is that strong. So if I can't be heard well, please try to let me know and maybe I can call in.
Okay,
But,
no, I hear you
I can be
very
brief.
well.
Oh, perfectly. Thank you. I can be brief. I share the concerns that are being stated. I would say it does seem to me that the concept of resiliency and anticipation of climate change is something that I believe has been very clearly established, and it's very important that it be addressed. I share the financial concerns and the administrative concerns that have been stated, by Fred and Bob. And I guess my overall concern in matters like this is it's the chicken or the egg, because we're creating a structure and we are going to be adding, new staff, but the funding source is unclear at best. And so I'm a little concerned that it's being handled in this order, and that we are then creating this infrastructure which will need to be fed. And so I would rather see that there be more focus at this time before proceeding in terms of how will this be funded and what is the best and most efficient financial way to handle this jointly with the county. So those are my observations. They really sort of echo within the context of what Fred and Bob have said.
Thank you, Ed. Anybody else from the commission? No? Okay. Any comments or questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Jim.
Yeah, so given the issues that have been raised and the concerns that some members of the commission have, what are our choices at this point in terms of this specific legislation? What are the choices presented to the commission? Is it accept, reject, defer, no opinion? What options do we have available?
Okay, let me ask David a question first. In terms of the legislative process, how long is this going to be going through the process, and how long do we as a commission have to weigh in on it?
So I'm glad that Alderman Arnett's on board also. But so the next step will be, it'll go to committee. I think it's going to go to at least to rules. It should go to finance, and I think it will. And I think it should go to environmental matters as well. So that will be over the, since we just finished the public hearing, normally it would go for second reader in 2 weeks at the next city council meeting, so that the council committees would hear it in the meantime and make recommendations. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, quite frankly. I'm not sure that we're going to be ready to take it to the full council in 2 weeks. I don't think that we will. I think that we need to work through it. The county process, legislative process, is much longer than ours. So a lot of your comments were about sort of the distribution of power between the city and the county. Please keep in mind that the county is the 800-pound gorilla in this case. They're 10 times bigger than the city, both in terms of projects, but also in the funding that's going to flow into this resilience authority. We're going to have 10%. They're going to have 90% flowing in. So they really are the 800-pound gorilla. And if they don't pass this legislation, I would say that the city should not pass it either. This needs to be a joint effort to be effective. So their process is longer than ours. Theirs isn't going to get passed probably as quickly as ours. If we do pass ours before they do, we're going to have the stipulation that it's null and void if the county doesn't pass their legislation. So I think that's a long way to say I think we can stretch out the legislative process on the city side a bit to more match up with the counties and have additional time to have discussions and considerations.
Okay, Bob.
David, I understand the 800-pound gorilla analogy, and I appreciate that concern. I mean, when it was, when I believe Lynn was going over the legislation and talking about the different projects that were under consideration, And I look at, basically what the city is
Yeah.
faced with. I'm sorry, did I miss? Lynn, was it you or Jackie? I'm sorry.
Jackie.
It was Jackie.
I'm sorry, Jackie.
It's okay.
My apologies. I see David Gerald under you. Okay, Jackie. But, certainly with the city of Annapolis, we're looking at preserving our downtown business district, our dock, our marina, Eastport, all that, and that's critical. When we look at, the county, roads and bridges, a lot of that's public works projects, and maybe they see an opportunity to dump this into an authority and take it off their regular books, if you will. I know Shady Side and Mayo, those are not heavily settled areas. They are, less dense in terms of population and so forth. Stormwater management issues right now, on the county level, already have a separate funding mechanism in place, these ERUs and stuff like that, which are being addressed through their various public work projects and stuff like that. If this legislation didn't go forward, the county would still be repairing its roads and bridges through its normal process. They still would be addressing stormwater management issues and stuff like that. Beyond that, I'm sure they're probably concerned about marinas and boat ramps and so forth as well. But, when you look at the city, I mean, you're looking at a significant portion of the city's tax base that's in jeopardy because of climate change, the downtown business district, and some of the key industries in the city that it depends upon, so I think that when you start weighing, the magnitude of the consequences that could result if you don't address resiliency related issues, I think the city has a big stake in this. And my opinion is the city perhaps has a bigger stake, in terms of the consequential, results that, that could occur if we don't address this than I think the county does. And I think that the city, quite frankly, has a greater need, for, a resiliency authority, if you will, to be able to fund some of these projects than perhaps the county does. As I noted, the county has some funding mechanisms already in place, to be able to address some of these issues. So, so it's, so they'll continue addressing them, whether this authority exists or not. The opportunity for them is to just, move, the debt service of funding these issues off of their books and into an authority, so anyhow, just my thoughts.
Bob,
Thank you,
I
Bob.
guess I would just say that the whole reason why that the county was supportive of this is they felt like they didn't currently have the either the funding capacity or the staff capacity to carry out the many projects that they envision needing to be done over, the next 50 years or so from a resilience perspective. That's why they're so supportive of this, is they feel like they need that. And I think eventually, I think initially that these projects will be implemented by the county public works and the city public works, but I think eventually the Resilience Authority will establish their own group of engineering construction professionals to carry these projects out. Because again, here in the city, if you look at the many projects that are going to be required here, I mean, City Dock is the easy one. It's expensive, but it's really the easy one because it's all city property and it's very well defined what the solutions are. But if you start looking at Eastport and some of the other low-lying areas, and the same in the county, the solutions are not as straightforward or as easy, and they're also going to be expensive. So the thought was to develop this highly specialized group of professionals within the Resilience Authority that knows how to tackle these resilience projects, and that's all they focus on, to provide that additional capacity, both from a funding perspective, but also staff to carry out the projects.
Yeah, well, David, I'm glad you mentioned that in terms of the composition of the membership and the qualifications, I believe, of the people that you would like to have on this board of directors, if you will. The legislation doesn't address credentialing of these members. Quite frankly, for all we know, these members could be political appointees, and perhaps another area of weakness in this legislation, would be the need to identify the credentialing of the type of people you're going to have as members of this authority. And these members perhaps don't need to be, doctorates of engineering and stuff like that, but they're certainly going to be hiring people, contractors and stuff like that, they're going to at least have to, be able to have the necessary knowledge and background to be able to perform that particular level of hiring and expertise or contracting, if you will. I would encourage that perhaps we take a closer look at the credentialing of these members of the Resiliency Authority. So at least they are perhaps a little bit more skilled and a little bit more knowledgeable than perhaps your average political appointee would be going on this thing.
Yeah,
Thank you, Bob.
I agree because it's true that one of their important functions, working with the director will be to hire that staff that eventually will be carrying out these projects. The staff would be hiring the contractors and consultants, but you need to have a good staff to do that. And so it would have to be, working with the director, not so much the chief financial officer, but the director and then the board to hire the right people.
Jim, and getting back to your question, and I deferred it to hear something about the timing. We have and will have certain options. I don't think we're in a position to take any position today, but eventually we can recommend approval, rejection, approval with amendments, or just express our concerns in the form of a report, similar to what we did for the budget, and using the comments that we've heard today, plus anything anybody else may have as a foundation for that report. Given the fact that this is not moving down the legislative track and won't at warp speed, I think we probably have enough time for me to prepare a draft letter to the administration and to the city council outlining our concerns as expressed here today, plus again anything else that anybody may want to weigh in on, and recommend probably that the legislation. Well, we can talk about whether we recommend the legislation not be approved until the concerns are addressed or at least considered, or take some other position. But my suggestion is that Russ, I'll be with you in a second. Is that we not take any position today. That I will volunteer to prepare a draft of a letter expressing some of these concerns, circulate it to the commission members for review, comment, revisions, other things you might want to have addressed, and then come back at our June meeting and discuss it further, and hopefully approve something to send to the city. So that would be my suggestion. But Ross, you had your hand up. You wanted to be recognized.
Just a couple things that were questions that occurred to me. First of all, I took copious notes. Thank you guys for doing this heavy lifting. But I was kind of astounded when Jackie mentioned roads and bridges, and immediately I don't see anything in here that really establishes a filter for what determines a resiliency project from a regular capital project. And that may be hard to do, but it seems to me that the Resiliency Authority really should be focused on what we identify as resiliency. I also think that we should be doing some more thinking about I agree that we need to identify revenue sources, and I know that some of the things that I've attended, some revenue sources are things like fees or tolls for use. And that would certainly be germane to roads. I mean, I don't know that we're going to be doing any roads that are big enough to become a toll road, but we've got to have something. Otherwise, we're just having a new authority that is issuing bonds to the same people that the city and the county are issuing bonds to regularly. I don't see any mention here of special um, privileges like lower rates for these bonds or higher rates for these bonds or something that make them distinguished from other bond issuances. So I think, and that to me uh, speaks to your point, Fred, that ultimately the city and the county are on the hook for this, no matter what kind of a entity we create. So, and then, I know there's going to be discussion about the composition of the board and amongst my colleagues about why we need to be doing this with the county as opposed to ourselves, and particularly if a lot of the funding for the downtown stuff is going to come from AREP, our Hillman Garage public-private partnership. And I really wonder how it's going to be determined, the priority of the projects when they're done, because the bond issuances are going to have to fund specific projects being staged. So yeah, I think I really think that this does need to be fleshed out considerably more.
Ross, I just want to comment on the comment you made about the county's priority for roads and bridges. In some cases, this will be an improvement to some existing roads or additional ones that need, or bridges that need to be constructed because of sea level rise or storm surges. And some bridges may need to be, and roads may need to be elevated. Now, we're considering that in the city as well. Where the Department of Transportation is looking at with us about, there may be some roads that are going to be non-functional anymore. We may have to abandon them and build additional roads or elevate roads and sidewalks. So we're considering that as part of our portfolio of climate change projects for the Resilience Authority.
I still think, I mean, it sounds like a capital project to me. So what is it that we get by making it a resiliency funding? It's capital project.
Yep.
So, I see walls, I see you could think of differently, but roads and bridges, protecting neighborhoods from sea level rise, I see that as resiliency, but fixing roads in Eastport, that's a capital project. And
Plus, I don't think they're looking at just fixing roads. They're looking at using roads as a means to control flooding, to wall off certain areas using the road instead of building a seawall. So it's not just going out and repaving.
Yeah,
it's really raising the elevation of the road to allow it to become a flood barrier.
So I don't want to take up the FAC. I think the FAC has already done a great service, but I can see compromise as being a road and a levee, but I don't see Severn Avenue or Chester being a road or a levee because there's people on the other side of it. So I think that getting a set of filters that really define resiliency from other capital projects is something I'm going to be bringing up. By the way, this is not going to the Finance Committee. It's going to Rules and Environmental Matters. And I think not going to Finance is an oversight, because I think the number one question is, where's the source of funds?
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean anything if there's no source of funds.
No, yeah, Ross, I'm surprised when you mentioned that this is not going to the Finance Committee of the City Council. I mean, this resiliency authority is being set up for the sole purpose of being able to finance.
Well, you can blame me. I didn't pay attention to that, Bob. I would have put my hand up. I should have put my hand.
Yeah, this whole authority concept is being set up to finance resiliency projects, and for the Finance Committee of the City Council not to have the opportunity to weigh in and to be able to study this is surprising to me. I mean,
As
So-
I said, I should have spoken up. That's on me.
But Ross, it's not too late to revisit that, is it?
David, has this been formally referred to the FAC, or will it formally be referred to the FAC, or should we just say, no, it hasn't been formally, but we're going to weigh in on it anyway?
Yeah, it hasn't
Yeah.
been in legislation referred to the fact.
Right, right.
Bob?
Yeah, Fred, I think that, yeah, we're an advisory commission. You know, I'm not at the point where I think the commission should say either approve or reject this. I'm more of the thought that we need to advise that we slow this thing down a little bit and do a little bit more due diligence on this and work through some of the issues that have been addressed. At least we, as a fact, as an advisory commission, feel that the administration, the city council needs to take a closer look at and to address. You know, there's some T's that need to be crossed and I's that need to be dotted. And I agree with your assessment that, you know, rather than make any decisions today, that we draft up all the points that were raised today as an advisory body to the administration, the city council, and submit those, and hopefully look forward to a response from the city council and the administration as they go through their process as to how they're going to address these issues before we weigh in as to whether we would, you know, support or not support something like this. Again, as I said from the beginning, I think the concept of a resiliency, you know, function has merit. I'm just concerned about the execution and the process that's been followed. This is a relatively new type of creature, if you will. When I say new, I don't mean within the last year or so, but certainly within the last 5 or 10 years, this concept of resiliency and creating these type of authorities, you know, here in the United States certainly is a lot newer than it is over in Europe and some of the other areas. And there was a wonderful publication that was submitted to us about a year ago that Teresa Sutherland made available to us, which some of us read through, which I thought was rather fascinating. But still, it's a relatively new concept in this country. And I think that if we're going to be one of the experimenters with it, my preference would be that we take the time and look at how to do it right, rather than, you know, trying to move this thing through and then find out that there are some problems here that we have to go back and correct, and you know, could create additional challenges. So,
Thank you, Bob. David?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so as far as since the legislation was passed by the state last year, only Charles County so far has formally set up a resilience financing authority. It's actually within the county structure, and it's mostly addressing issues on private property. So they're using sort of the concept of betterments to set up taxes for those properties that benefit from the projects. And they're using the Resilience Authority to do those types of things that are much more difficult, I guess, by the city or by the county government in that case. So they apparently have a lot of issues on private property, and so they're using the county staff to do those projects and then charging it directly to the beneficiaries of those projects. Just another way to think about how this authority can work.
Queen Anne's County also has just established one.
Okay.
That one's new.
I'm sorry, who?
Queen Anne's County.
Queen Anne's.
Thank you for that additional information. Any other comments on this before we move on in the agenda?
Fred, if I could ask,
Yeah.
if you have your comments and notes, and I was particularly struck by your comments on the articles of incorporation and the things that weren't there, that I think that could be very helpful to the council committees whenever you're ready to share it, or the committee is ready to share it.
Yeah,
Commissioner.
well, Russ, I will send you my notes. I read from them. They're public information. And what I'll do is send it to you, and I'll send them to the other commission members. And David, I'll send them to you as well.
Thank you.
And then I suspect that you will see them again in a letter, as part of a letter, maybe a little bit more articulate or refined. Bob, did you have your hand
Yeah,
up?
David and Jackie, during the working groups that were set up over the last, 12 months or so, between the county and the city, were there any other jurisdictions in the country that were looked at that formed these type of resiliency financing authorities, and how they were structured and what they addressed? Was there any, type of research or study done on
Yeah.
best
Bob,
practices, at least in the United States?
right, Bob. We actually brought in, there's a group that's set up in Rhode Island. There's another group that's in New Jersey that have been set up for a while. So we actually brought in and it was all via Zoom, of course, but we brought in the executive directors of those organizations. They've been in existence for years and are well established and financially stable to discuss, the process that they went through and the types of projects and how they fund them. So it was very enlightening to hear from those groups that have been around for a while and how they've done it, and sort of what qualifications that they, to your point of, you need well-qualified people to run this thing. What sort of qualifications that were expected for the people that were on the board, but more importantly, what they expected from the directors, the executive directors, because this is really, as you mentioned, a financial organization. So all of those have financial people in charge. They're not technical, as much as I'd like them to be more technical and engineers, but they're not. They're all financial people that run these organizations.
With the when you talked with these groups, I'm sure they shared with you the revenue streams that they were able to access to be able to not only underwrite the authority's work, but to also support, bond issuances and service debt and so forth. Still, the working group with that type of information did not feel comfortable in diving into what type of potential revenue sources could be made available to a similar authority if we were to create one here between the city and the county. I mean,
right. Yeah, no, that's right. That was what the recommendation was to allow the authority to really delve into what the options are and look at what they felt like what the best options were to move forward with the revenue. Part of it, I think, was the concern that naming potential revenue sources might be too politically fraught to do. They thought there was a thought that might derail the legislation if that's too specific. So it was thought to be better to allow them to have that same type of information or reach out to those organizations and talk to them, but then for the authority to make those recommendations.
Well, that's a proverbial bridge that's going to have to be crossed. So.
Yeah, Bob, I'd like to move on, because I would like to try and get this meeting over by 9:30. I appreciate your comments.
Hey, Fred,
Yes,
Fred, can I make just a 2-second
yes.
comment, which is just a very quick Google search for what that's worth tells me that the University of North Carolina School of Government has decided to study this resiliency concept in Maryland. And they have an article on their website in which they are speaking in some detail about it and suggesting that they intend to follow its development. So that might be of interest to understand why they are focusing on it and whether we might get the benefit of some of their insights.
Thank you, Ed. So unless I hear a commission member say otherwise, I will take it upon myself to prepare a working draft of a letter to the city council and to the administration regarding this particular ordinance and the comments we've heard today, and send it out to commission members for review, comment, editing, etc., and then take it up again at our June meeting. Any objection to that? Nope. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. I think that hopefully will be a constructive way to move this forward. David and Jackie, thank you very much for your presentation and your comments and being there in the line of fire. So
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, David.
thank you. Okay, let's move on the agenda. I don't think there's anything significant, but finance. Katie, do you have anything from the finance department of general moment, general operation, or anything new on the FY22 budget process?
Nothing new. We're working through amendments now, drafting those, the ones that we have received. I sent out do you guys usually get the budget or the quarterly budget versus actuals reports from us?
No.
Okay. We finished up those, sent those out to department heads and council. And that is all the updates that I have.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anybody have any questions of Katie's updates? Hearing none. Jim Cardillo, anything from the audit committee this month?
Two things. One, the city has received the FY20 CAFR. The audit committee did not review the CAFR because the single audit portion of the audit was not ready yet. So that was deferred to the next audit committee meeting. Secondly, the audit committee received a presentation from an outside consulting firm, Forest Consulting, that has helped the city implement performance measures into the annual budgeting process for department heads. This is a major step for city financial management and overall budget authority for department heads. So the consultants had provided the city with initial guidelines on how to set performance measures, how to evaluate them, and how to monitor them. And that is then turned over to the deputy city manager, Ms. Farrow.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Anybody have any questions about Jim's report on the audit committee? No, thank you, Jim. Bob, anything on the spending affordability subcommittee?
Yes, Fred, we've been in communication with David, Jody, and we've identified jurisdictions within the state of Maryland that do have a spending affordability, a spending affordability type function, whatever name they choose to attach to it. And David has provided us with some guidance as to what the administration feels would be very useful in terms of which jurisdictions to be able to connect with, to learn how they have put their spending affordability function in place and how it operates. So over the course of the summer, Ed and I will start the process of gathering this information, and I would assume the hope, and Ed, I encourage you to weigh in. I think the intent is to perhaps have something towards the end of the summer for the FAC to be able to take a look at and provide any guidance or questions that they feel that we need to look at further if need be before we send it off to the administration and the city council for their review. So there's so it's a handful of months of work still involved here before we can get something together.
Bob, thank you and Ed very much for you taking this project on, and look forward to continuing reports and ultimately work product at the end of the summer or early fall, whenever you can complete your work. So thank you very much, Bob and Ed. We did not receive a monthly board and commissions email from Hillary, so there's no update on that. Unfinished business, pension and retirement benefits. I don't remember where we left that at the last meeting, but I know that was something that Ed initially brought up. I know that I think David asked us to hold off on that until after union negotiations, if that's my recollection. And I think somebody also mentioned that there had been some study or work done on this by one of the city departments. Maybe I'm thinking of something else, but does anybody have anything to add on, the status of pension and retirement benefits?
Yeah, just a quick question, Fred. You mentioned that we were going to hold off discussion of those until after union negotiations, or?
I thought, David, go ahead.
Yes, so this spring, we were in negotiations with the unions for the FY22 budget, because we thought we might have to seek some concessions, either the COLA or furloughs or the step increases. So we were in the throes of that, and it didn't seem like a good time to open this issue. It wasn't with regard to the upcoming new master labor agreement that we're going to have to get in place before FY23. It was just for those negotiations going on this spring for the FY22 budget.
Okay, so David, is that something that you feel we could at least take a look at and become educated about now?
I'm hopeful that well, Ross put his hand up. I'm going to see what Ross says. I'm hopeful that we won't need to reopen those negotiations for FY22.
Yeah, it feels to me like things are coalescing nicely. The FAC report and the Finance Committee report on 22 both said, this is a balanced budget, but the upcoming years, and the big critical issue in all of our spending is the contract negotiations. It drives everything. And one of our considerations could be in negotiations, things like moving from defined benefit to defined contribution for all new members. It could be moving new members to the state pension for public safety officers. I've asked from Trish Hopkins what the state pension looks like. I haven't received that, and I need to ping on her for that. But the growth in our personnel costs is much more rapid than the growth in our revenue sources. And we can't sustain that. And we need to look for other things. And when you have our most expensive people have their wages normally from COLAs and other things growing at about 10, 12%, and then you compound that with a 35% salary surcharge for the contribution to the pension plan, you can see that those two compounding rates are going to explode. We won't be able to afford anything other than police and fire, if that. So we really do have to figure out a way. And I know the city manager and I've had many discussions. We really do have to look at this and get the revenue source and the expenditure growth in balance, or we won't have a balanced budget. So I think looking at that now over the next few months, I would be very happy to see that kind of thought by the Financial Advisory Commission.
Okay. And if you can, because it's been a while since you sent your initial email saying you wanted some information about this. Do you recall exactly what it was you were putting on the table or asking for?
Yes, what I was wondering was to what extent we have information that can help us understand how we compare to other similarly sized municipalities. And I thought there was some indication that there was at least some information available on that score, but I don't recall that it was circulated.
Right.
I think Tricia Hopkins has that.
Okay.
And
David,
she
can
did
I
it for
ask you
the employee compensation? I mean, the alderman and city manager compensation committee.
Yeah, I shared the fact that was provided to us during that commission, not too many months ago.
Okay. David, could you see that as a starting point, that information is circulated to the FAC?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we'll get that before the next meeting. Whatever information we have available that was put together, we'll provide that.
Okay, and if you can get it to us, a week or two before the meeting, that'll be helpful, so we have an opportunity to review it. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, anything more on that for the moment? And Bob, thanks for questioning me on that, but I wasn't dreaming. David did ask us to hold off, and David, thank you for clarifying that the hold is lifted. And we'll at least begin to move forward on that. That ends our regular agenda. Our next meeting is June 10th, 8 a.m. Video conference. Hopefully there won't be any need for me to send you all an email saying emergency, we have to have a special meeting because we've had quite a few meetings, and thank you all for your patience and indulgence on that, both commission members and staff. So anything else for the good of the order today? Yes, David.
So more of a logistic type thing, but so we have brought the city council back in to do live meetings. We're encouraging all of, well, the every 2 week full council meeting we're having in person. We're not allowing the public in for those yet, but testimony can be taken from Skype. We're going to have the council committee meetings in person as well. We're still encouraging the boards and commissions to meet virtually, but we need to start thinking, over the next, maybe this fall, of coming back to having in-person meetings, if that's what you choose to do. So we're going to leave that up to the boards and commissions for a while to determine, when we are ready to start having in-person meetings, if you want to do that or not. But just something to start thinking about. It's not a big rush. It's more of a, the next 6 months planning on if you want to come back and start having in-person meetings again.
All right, thanks for that info, David. I've found these Zoom meetings to be very efficient and also to be very easy on the schedule. A lot less traveling for everybody, but we'll have a commission discussion and see what we want to do. And thanks for bringing that up. Anything else from anybody else, commission members or staff today? Thank you very much for good, healthy discussion, good meeting, and entertain a motion to adjourn. Bob Burden, seconded by Jim Cardillo. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
We're adjourned.